She is the woman who arguably started it all. The great Tudor dynasty's matriarch, Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of King Henry VII, and a truly fascinating figure in her own right. Born a great heiress with royal blood, Margaret's life was one of highs and lows, but in the end she rose to extreme power, a queen in all but name. In recent years, thanks to historical fiction, she has become a figure of controversy, portrayed as an evil religious zealot, obsessed with getting her son on the throne, and even to some people's mind, the mastermind behind the disappearance of the princes in the Tower. But is this interpretation of her in any way accurate? Well, today, to answer all of this and much more, I'm thrilled to welcome historian and author Lauren Johnson onto the podcast for the first time. Lauren's upcoming book, Margaret Beaufort, Survivor, Rebel, Kingmaker, is the backbone of this conversation, and I am sure, based on the interview, that there will be a lot of new information in there about this remarkable woman. So join Lauren and I as we explore the life of Margaret Beaufort and smash apart some of the long-held beliefs about her life and her life story. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest Podcast, episode 81, Margaret Beaufort, Survivor, Rebel, Kingmaker, with Lauren Johnson. Welcome to the Tudor Chest Podcast, Lauren Johnson. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. A little bit plaguey, but that's on brand for 15th century people.
I was about to say, that's very appropriate. We're here today to talk about a fascinating figure from history, Margaret Beaufort. You've got a book that's, I believe, coming out in November?
It is, yes. Available for pre-order now.
There you go, folks. Pre-order is live. So Margaret Beaufort, Survivor, Rebel, Kingmaker. It's not your first work, so is it? I think you also wrote a book about... In fact, I know you did. You wrote a book about Henry VI, because I've got it right above me.
Yes, probably taking up enormous amounts of shelf space, yes.
It's quite a beast.
Yeah. I did the biography of Henry VI a few years ago. And before that, I did one that was about a history of the year 1509 when Henry VIII came to the throne. So I kind of feel like I've gone from Henry VI through Henry VIII and like Margaret Beaufort, the beautiful little sandwich filling in the middle, providing a link between them.
Absolutely. Before we get into a discussion about her story and sort of the fact your book, I suppose, underpins a lot of what, the opinion you're going to have. But before we do that, a few questions to get to know you a bit better, if that's okay. So could you provide me with a short introduction to your background? So where you grew up and what you now do full time?
Yeah, I'm from Bristol originally. I grew up there. In fact, in Cary Grant's old house where he grew up, we got a plaque last autumn. I'm really excited about it.
That is so cool. Cary Grant's old house.
Yeah, we basically, me and Cary, we're housemates. So that's where I grew up.
And his ghost?
I never saw his ghost. He would have been a little kid, so it would have been a really creepy ghost.
Fair, okay.
Yeah. There is a slightly spooky part of our house. My parents still live there, but my mum doesn't like me telling people that, so you'll have to pretend you haven't heard. And I don't do anything full-time. I'm your classic freelancer. I have 15 part-time jobs. I'm doing a PhD part-time, which is about Tudor Catholic refugees in Europe and their relationship with Rome. I'm bringing up my daughter, as part-time as humanly possible. And I work in heritage a lot, doing live performance, live education sessions, sort of work in character, storytelling, loads of different elements, anything to do with like public history and storytelling. I do.
What sparked your passion for history, maybe specifically in this case Tudor history? Was there something when you were young that ignited that?
It's really weird. I was thinking about this. I can't remember a time when I didn't find history interesting. In the same way, I can't really remember not being interested in stories either. Like I just always felt this pull towards towards the past, I suppose. I'd go wandering around old castles and mansions with my parents, and I'd be thinking, oh, is there a secret door that I could go through to step back into the past? What would happen? And with the Tudors, I feel like it's something that's very present, I guess, because we do it in primary school. So I can't remember like learning about it. I just remember knowing it and being like, oh yeah, Henry VIII and the Six Queens and Elizabeth I. And I definitely had like an egg cosy, which was in the shape of Elizabeth I or Henry VIII. I can't remember which one. I had two. And like, I don't know what an egg cosy is really. I've never used it, but I remember having one that I must have got in a National Trust gift shop when I was a kid. And then strangely, like I studied history, I did it up to masters, and I didn't really do much of the Tudors. I maybe felt like I sort of, was like, oh, I sort of know that, that's fine. And it was only when I started working at Hampton Court Palace doing live costumed work in like 2008-9 that I'd sort of stepped back into it and was going, oh, okay, yeah, I don't really know this era. There's a lot more going on than I thought. The 15th century, so like early Tudor, has always sort of been a bit more of the area that I was drawn to, I think.
It's interesting, isn't it, I think a lot of people, and this is certainly the case for me, is that the Tudors are often sort of your gateway drug because, to your point, they feel when you're British, they feel very present. They're always bubbling in the back of your mind when you're little because I learn about them as we all do. You know the name Henry VIII, you know the name Anne Boleyn, just as part of everyday sort of culture of being British. But when you really start digging into their story, I don't know about you, but I'm becoming more and more and more fascinated by the Plantagenets. And I think you people are pulled into history by the Tudors, and then there's that natural desire to then look either side and go, okay, do I go to the Stuarts or do I go to the Plantagenets? And for me, it's absolutely the latter.
Yeah, same. And particularly for me, because women's history is such an area of interest for me. And the 15th century has so many underexplored, fascinating women. It's just really interesting. And also it's very alien, I think. Maybe the Tudors sort of strangely, because it's the early modern, but it's still the modern, like maybe they feel a little bit more familiar to us almost.
I think that, and I think because there's so many portraits as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You can see them. Whereas the 15th century, you're kind of creating images in your head the whole time. It's almost like a fantasy. Yeah,
and going back even earlier, we have absolutely no clue what Eleanor of Aquitaine looked like. Not a clue. We don't even know what Margaret of Anjou looked like. And I think that's why there's always that sort of eternal fascination, because there are so many remarkable women, and we only have whispers of them in many ways.
Yeah. But one of the things I feel is kind of sometimes underappreciated is that there is a lot of information about women in the same way there's lots of information about working people. It's just that you have to work quite a lot harder to get it. Like it is there, but you have to dig to uncover more of the information. And you kind of also just have to accept that there will be some things you do not know, which is frustrating, but like that's part of it. That's where the interpretation element comes into it, getting as much information as possible and then kind of making your best guess.
With that in mind, so if you could jump in a time travel machine and witness one moment from history, do you have one?
I don't think I do. I would love to go back to a year. I would go back to the year 1485. I've thought that for ages. This is like my perennial question on walks. I'm unbearable. I'll be like, when would you go back in time? Go on, tell me. Oh, would it be the Roman era? What would it be? Because I find it fascinating. But like, as a result, I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. And if it was a year, it would be 1485. And then you could see Margaret Beaufort. You could see Richard III because he would still be around. You could see Henry VII coming in. You could see Elizabeth Woodville and Elizabeth of York, like all of these big figures. Unfortunately, Margaret of Anjou's gone by that point, which is a shame. But the trouble is like that's a whole year. And there's no point when all of them kind of intersect. I was like, would it be the Battle of Bosworth? Because Henry and Richard are both there, but, no women. Why bother? So if I can have a whole year, it would be that year, like Christmas 1484 to Christmas 1485. I think that would be really interesting.
And because we're here to talk about Margaret, if you could have the opportunity to ask her one question, what would it be?
I literally don't know. I've been thinking about this all day because you said in advance you would ask this, and I was like, what on earth would I ask her? Like, it's so hard because I feel simultaneously, like through the process in particular of writing this book and researching it, I've got to know her so well, and I feel I sort of understand her, that there aren't that many questions I have left where I haven't kind of been forced to come up with an idea for myself of what I think the likeliest answer would be. And I think any of my questions that are left, she would be like, I'm not answering that. Don't be absurd. I'm not going to tell you what I really think about my husbands. I'm not going to tell you like about my childhood traumas. So it's so hard. I want to ask the internet. I want the internet to tell me what they would ask her, because like I simultaneously have 5 million questions and none that I haven't already spent however many years it is now, like trying to think about. Do you have one? I was curious.
Well, the one that pops into my head is, were you involved in the disappearance of the Princess in the Tower? Because I don't believe she was. It's kind of that I'm almost be forcing that question upon her for shock effect. I don't know if I do. Again, because there are obvious questions with other people. Like I would, if it was Anne Boleyn, I'd say, when were you born? You know? But with Margaret, yeah, I think there is a lot that we kind of... I suppose I would like to know, and we'll come to this later, but maybe if she had to answer honestly when she signed letters off as Margaret R, was that her trying to claim Margaret Regina, or was it Margaret Richmond? And we'll come on to that because I want to ask you about it. But maybe that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a theory about that as well. You see, this is.
Well, we will come to that then. So, as I said, we're here to talk about Margaret Beaufort, but also through the prism of your book. It's coming out in November. Margaret Beaufort, Survivor, Rebel, Kingmaker. So, to start right at the beginning, really, what is Margaret Beaufort's ancestry? A lot of people know that she was a member of the English nobility, but how was she actually linked to the royal family?
She is a cousin of the royal family. I suppose that's like the simplest way to put it. It is literally impossible to do anything in the 15th century to do with the royal family or nobility without making 500 family trees. So if everyone can like just imagine a family tree, I think the easiest way is like if you go back to Edward III, so that's, you know, mid 14th century, let's say, and Edward III's son, one of them gives rise to Richard II's line, so that Plantagenet line, that gets scrubbed out. Another line through John of Gaunt gives rise to the Lancastrian rulers, Henry IV, V, VI. And then, confusingly for everyone, John of Gaunt also has a bunch of children who have the surname Beaufort, who start off as like the half-siblings, basically, of the Lancastrian dynasty. And over time, obviously, they get further and further away. So I was literally looking at something earlier that was explaining what a second cousin versus a first cousin once removed was. And I still couldn't work it out. I was like, I think Margaret Beaufort is like the second cousin once removed of Henry VI. But like the key is she has royal blood. It is from Edward III, ultimately.
Yeah.
And she then develops a closer relationship to Henry VI because she marries as her second husband, Henry VI's half-brother. So there's like a sort of confusing hodgepodge of relations. But the key is she has a blood line directly to a previous king.
But it is, well, so by the time Margaret comes along, had the Beaufort name been legitimised? Because for a long time there was this, they were seen as the illegitimate line. I know Richard II, I think, is the person that does legitimise them. So is Margaret around for that? I don't think she would have been.
No, that's before her. She's born in 1443. So okay. It's actually her great... Oh, God, I wrote this down earlier just to try and remember. John of Gaunt is her great-grandfather. So John of Gaunt is the one who marries Catherine Swynford after having a very long extramarital affair with her. And that's where the Beauforts come from. And John of Gaunt makes sure after he has got married that through Parliament and through the Pope, his union and the Beauforts are legitimised. But once Henry IV becomes king, because then there's this slightly tricky situation where Henry IV has a Lancastrian claim, but also he has all of these half-siblings who are sort of semi-legitimate, like legitimate after the fact, basically. They put in place a statute in 1407 that says this family is definitely legitimate, but they can't inherit the throne, essentially. However, as we know from the 15th century, well, from 1399 onwards, basically, when Henry IV takes over as a Lancastrian king, the blood right is only sort of part of it. So even though Margaret Beaufort is sort of technically legitimate, but also technically not supposed to have a claim to the throne, we know in 1450, when her first marriage is being arranged, that there is an understanding of her as a blood claimant, that there is a suggestion that she has a right to the throne, because the father-in-law, basically, who she is supposed to have, who is one of Henry VI's leading advisors, a man called William de la Pole, he is, effectively lynched after being put through Parliament and condemned as the traitor. And one of the things that he is accused of is trying to get at the throne by marrying his son to Margaret Beaufort. So there's clearly already an understanding that she has a blood right, I'd say. And it's very important in that early period of her life, like the first 10 years of her life, because there is no Lancastrian legitimate heir. Henry VI doesn't have a child until 1453. And in the absence of that child, his major sort of successor is going to be the Duke of York, with whom he has a very fractious relationship. And I believe that part of the reason that Henry VI arranges Margaret Beaufort's second marriage to his half-brother Edmund Tudor is to kind of try and create an alternative succession line if he never has a son. So I really think that there is a general understanding, even if like the legal element of it is a little questionable, that Margaret has a claim to the throne.
Yeah, because I suppose the thing is, because Henry IV, as he was, when he was Henry Bolingbroke, by usurping the throne, it does sort of overturn. It causes a split, really, doesn't it? Because in a way, what it's saying is, if a king is deemed unsuitable, knock him off the throne, put somebody else in who's better. Now, that sounds trite and that's bringing it down, but that ultimately is what went on here. So it kind of did set a bit of a dangerous precedence for future monarchs.
Yeah, it absolutely did. And it's something that actually was kind of already there in the English system, because if you think of someone like King John, way back in the 1200s.
William the Conqueror.
Yeah, absolutely. Like King John is made to obey the laws according to Magna Carta. So he is made to understand himself not just as a king, but also as a person who has rights and responsibilities and duties to the people who are beneath him, technically. So there's a very strong feeling by the 15th century that a king needs to be a good king, not just be a king.
So when Margaret's father dies, is she his sole heiress, and the wealth that she inherited, how big is this wealth we're talking about? Is it, is there truth in the fact that she became one of the wealthiest women in England?
Yeah, it's a very tragic beginning, really, for Margaret. So she's born in 1443. Her father has spent almost half his life, pretty much by that point, a prisoner of war in France because of the 100 Years' War. He's returned to England, like his ransom was immense, so he was very financially troubled. So he puts a lot of energy in the very brief period of time that he is back in England into like getting as much money and status as possible from the crown. Which means that by the time Margaret is born, he's actually accrued an enormous amount of money, what would probably be millions, or at least like 1.5 million in modern terms. And he dies within a year of Margaret's birth, and she is left effectively with at least half of that wealth. So she is almost a millionairess, we would understand it today. She is phenomenally rich. But the strange thing with Margaret is we remember her as being the sole heir because she's the only heir. She's the only legitimate child of her father. He does have an illegitimate daughter as well. But she has loads of half siblings. So even though she has this weird status completely as an heiress in her own right, she also has a status as a sister of many, many people. And right from birth, she's growing up in this extended family, like a patchwork quilt is how I envisaged it in my mind. And so that's kind of, that sense of family responsibility and family concern is something that's like just baked into her, I think, from her earliest memories.
So where did she spend her childhood, and who is it that's raising her then?
Well, if her father had lived, she probably would have grown up in the West Country. She would have grown up in around Dorset, probably around Corfe Castle, Wimborne Minster. But because her father dies, all of that estate goes to his brother, Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. And so instead, Margaret moves back with her mother up to the sort of the Midlands, really. Kind of, well, the middle, maybe the Midlands is a bit wrong. It's Bedfordshire and the Fenlands, really. Okay. And that's kind of, I think, for the rest of her life, that area, and particularly Bedfordshire through to Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire, is her heartland. It's the land that she really cares about and knows, I'd say.
And so she's raised by her mother?
Yes.
Predominantly.
She's raised by her mother, who has, at one point, 9 children, I think. Like, curiously, her mother's actually pregnant at the time Margaret's father dies, but we never hear anything more about that child. So presumably she either miscarried or there was a stillbirth. But there are an enormous number of siblings from her mother's first marriage, and then there's another brother who comes from a subsequent marriage. So yeah, a real hodgepodge of different ages and children living within either Bletsoe or Maxey Castle.
So you hinted earlier that she's married off, and she's married off at a very young age. So who does she marry, and what is her husband's story? I should also just caveat, this is technically her second marriage, right?
Yeah, so she has one marriage when she is like 6 or 7, which isn't completely a proper marriage. But I think in her head at the time, she would have understood it to be, this is the person I'm going to marry. But we'll ignore him for the sake of clarity, because the first marriage that is sort of really significant and that definitely does take place is her marriage when she is probably 12, which is the legal age of consent for girls in the 15th century, to Edmund Tudor, who is the half brother of Henry VI. And the Tudors are like, this is sort of their first entrance almost into history. It's quite fascinating. Before this point, they are a Welsh family of reasonably mysterious origin, I feel like. Up to this point, but there's this kind of legendary love affair between Owen Tudor, who is a servant of Catherine Valois, who is a French princess and the Queen of England, which gives rise to Edmund and Jasper Tudor, their 2 children. And Edmund's marriage to Margaret is arranged by King Henry VI. And like I say, I think it was probably arranged in order to create a sort of slight alternative succession. It never comes into effect because in the same year that this marriage is organised by Henry, he has a son. So it's sort of a moot point. The big thing that's really important to this story, though, is that Margaret gets married at 12 and almost immediately is pregnant. And her husband is a lot older than her. We don't actually know exactly when he's born, but he's probably in his late 20s by this point. And it's like, it's not normal to do this, I'd say.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask you next, is that the shocking act of impregnating her. So is this viewed as gross, even by the standards of the day?
I think it's definitely viewed as unwise. Okay. I think that's the big element of it. There have been some demographic studies that have shown that the average age of a first pregnancy for noble women is 20. Which is way older than when they get married. It's quite usual to start arranging marriages when the royals or nobility are actually, basically in their cradles, like literal children. But even if people are living together, even if couples are living together whilst they're engaged, but before they're married, they don't seem to start a sexual relationship until they're older, like between 14, 16, as I say, not pregnant until about 20, it seems like on average. And it's for a really sensible reason. For one thing, it seems like menstruation starts a bit later in the medieval era. So, biologically, it is more difficult for them to have children until they're a little bit older. But also, it's just really bad for you. If you've put loads of your financial resources into a marriage, you don't want it immediately being catastrophically ruined by the bride and mother either dying in childbirth, or being left biologically damaged, so she's unable to have more children. So even leaving aside for a moment the fact that we're dealing with human beings who have a level of empathy, they also know that it's just not good sense to try and marry someone in that way. I suspect that maybe what happened here is that Edmund Tudor is that much older. He doesn't have a sister. He doesn't have a mother who is still alive. So maybe the voices who might have been there going, well, hold on, just wait a little bit, because, it would be sensible to let Margaret settle into life and be a little bit older before she has a child, aren't there. And she is fairly quickly removed from her mother's care and taken to deepest Wales. So she is 200 miles from her family network. So it's it is shocking. And it's also, I don't think we can overstate how traumatizing probably the whole experience of Margaret's early marriage and pregnancy would have been.
I mean, that is a 12-year-old it's a child. There is no getting around the fact that it's a child to modern ears and eyes, maybe not so for the time. But do you think there's even a possibility here then that Edmund was also, so by the time Margaret is pregnant, had Henry VI had a son?
Yes.
Okay. So, because I was going to say, do you think there's any chance that Edmund was effectively right, I'm going to try and get Margaret pregnant, she'll have a child, and whilst I'm alive, my child would then have a really strong claim to the throne. So is that almost he'll take the risk of Margaret's health to give birth to a child that would then have a claim to the throne? Do you think there's any chance that is what's going through his head?
I think probably not by this point, because Margaret gives birth in very early 1457. Edmund actually dies during her pregnancy in 1456. So by that point, you've already got the rise of York and his line as a real sort of alternative contender. Although it's worth emphasising, even he has not as yet said he wants the throne, he thinks he should have the throne, anything like that. It is far more about just having control of government. I think that Edmund's chief concern was the fact that Margaret was really rich and had her own, claim on the Beaufort estate, and that he wanted to get hold of that. And I think it's one thing in the Wars of the Roses that sometimes gets a little bit confused, because so much of the storytelling around it tends to be around the crown and the different royal figures who come in and out of it. But actually, I think we need to remember that even leaving that out, there is an enormous noble class here who are dealing in vast estates, lands that have got hundreds of people who are, effectively their underlings, who are giving them their taxes, their rents, who are making their lands profitable with farming, with markets and all that sort of thing. So being a lord in and of itself is a really big thing, and then being a lord who also has the title of earl or of duke or whatever it might be is even more desirable. So I think there's an enormous amount of ambition, but I think it is ambition for a noble status rather than a royal one.
Got it. Okay. So Margaret, surprisingly, she carries the baby to full term. She gives birth when she will have turned 13 by this point. She has a son, Henry. So do you believe there is truth in the long-held theory that, due to Margaret's youth, that the pregnancy permanently impeded her ability to have more children? Could we also say it maybe put her completely off sex? What's your feelings around that?
My suspicion is that she may not have been physically damaged, as it were, but I think psychologically she will have been profoundly affected by that experience, because I mean, there's very little information around at this time. There's very slightly more for Margaret than there is for almost every other noble mother at this time. But there's very little information. And yet all of that information seems to suggest that even decades after Margaret had given birth, it still seemed extraordinary that she had been this like very slight, small, almost frail child who gave birth to this. I mean, the way it's described by her confessor is almost like this giant son. How did he come out of such a tiny woman? But like, there's that element to it. And also that there was plague at the time, that she was completely isolated, that she was a widow, like she was in an incredibly vulnerable position without any of her support network around her. And my feeling, which is slightly different from what lots of people have previously said about Margaret's relationship with Henry, is that as soon as he was born, she just wanted to get out of there. That's my feeling, is basically as soon as she could, according to the customs of the time, leave him, she did. And she went and arranged a different marriage, and she took control of her own future in a way that was politically astute, that was emotionally important for her, and she went and lived back near where her mother was. And I can really easily see that, having had such a traumatic experience when she was still so young herself, it was almost like she drew a line under it and went, didn't happen, don't have to think about it. And that from that point on, I think she probably did. My suspicion is she did want to have more children. She thought she would have more children. She went on to marry someone called, I call him Harry Stafford. He's also called Henry Stafford, but because of the enormous number of Henrys, I was like, just call him Harry. He writes his name Harry once. I'm sticking to it. She marries Harry Stafford in 1458. He's the son of the Duke of Buckingham, so like one of the most powerful mediators and lords in the country. And her and Harry Stafford just go and have this very lovely, peaceful little life in Lincolnshire. They live very near her mother, her siblings. She spends time with them. And there is almost no information at all about any continuing relationship with Henry until we get to like the mid 1460s, which it could just be that we don't have the documentary evidence for that period. It is entirely possible. But I have a really strong suspicion that Margaret, almost like we might call it today, like postnatal depression or something like that, that something really profound was going on with her psychologically that meant she didn't want to have a relationship with this person who had caused her so much harm. And she actually doesn't go back to Wales for almost 10 years.
I see, that's quite a big departure, I suppose, from the expected convention. That's a different take on it, definitely.
Yeah, I know that there's always been this idea that Margaret and Henry the Tudor have a really, like, almost unnaturally close relationship. And I think in part that is because most of her history until fairly recently has been written by men. And I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding when it comes to mothers and children, and particularly mothers and sons. And I think we know from later in life that Margaret and Henry are very close. But they don't know each other. They don't live with each other. For most of Henry's childhood, he is living with other people, and like we could talk a little bit about that, the details of that in a minute. Then he's in exile, so he's not even in the same country as her, and he comes back to her basically when he is almost the age that Edmund had been when she met him. And like, just how weird that must have been for her to be like, oh God, okay, right, my son is a fully grown person, and she's like, the relative age difference between them is so small that she must have had this strange position of almost like older sister as well as mother. And like, I think it makes total sense that she, being such a family-minded person, that she wants a relationship with him and with his wife and with his children when they have the opportunity to do it. But I just don't think that in those early years there's evidence for that relationship. Yeah,
and I feel your pain about so many of the same name, because my book that I wrote that came out last year was about the rise and fall of Margaret Pole and her family. And the bits towards the start where I'm talking about Margaret Beaufort in the same sentences I'm speaking about Margaret Pole, it was just so frustrating because You know, you have to think about the way the reader is reading it. And so I had to always include I couldn't just say the name. I had to include the surname because otherwise you might get confused. So I feel your pain.
Yeah, I've basically not named Margaret Pole in my book. I've just been like, Lady Pole, that'll do. Margaret Beaufort, incidentally, I just want to mention this. She had, as well as her mother being Margaret, her grandmother was Margaret, her granddaughter is Margaret, and her half-sister is Margaret.
Well, it's also like when you mention Princess Mary and like which one? There's Henry's sister or Henry VIII's sister or Henry VIII's daughter. That gets confusing as well. So with hindsight, and I think thanks to shows like The White Queen, it comes across as Margaret being this extremely staunch Lancastrian through and through, and thus she hated anything to do with the Yorks. Is this true?
No.
Okay.
This is like one of my big bugbears. Yeah, it's one of my pet peeves. Is she absolutely wasn't a staunch Lancastrian. What she was a pragmatist, I'd say. I think you can see in the way that she develops as a political player that she's constantly learning. I think she learns a lot from her mother. I think she learns a lot from her mother-in-law, who is the Duchess of Buckingham, Anne, who is also the sister of Cecily Neville, mother of Edward IV and Richard III. So, like, she has a lot of really influential figures around her when she's growing up who are really good and capable women throughout her whole time that she is growing up. And I think she learns a lot from them. And then I think she also tries as far as possible to adapt to situations as they arise. But one thing that I really was kind of struck by in her story is that there's this period of time, I mean, it's an absolute mess when you're trying to tell it as a historian anyway, but between 1469 and 1471, when we've got this, like, we first have a Yorkist regime, then we have a Lancastrian that's a little bit Yorkist, then we have Yorkist again. And Margaret just keeps like flip-flopping because she's desperately like, the only thing she wants is to sort of keep control of the earldom of Richmond, sort of for herself and for Henry. And so she just keeps choosing the wrong side throughout it. And after that, I think she becomes much more sensible and sort of holds back from making decisions. But it's really noteworthy, I think, in 1461, when Henry VI is knocked off the throne and replaced by Edward IV of York, within a matter of months, Margaret and Harry Stafford have made a deal with him to protect her land so that she can inherit. And even though that means that her own son, Henry Tudor, is brought up by one of the leading Yorkists, William Herbert, even though she just doesn't see him for years and years, she's willing to do that because it protects the rest of her family. And she actually becomes quite sort of ingrained into the Yorkist regime. Like, she has Edward IV come round for dinner in 1468. She later on is, when she's married to Thomas Stanley, her last husband, who is a leading member of the Yorkist regime in the 1470s. Again, she's at court a lot. She's part of these big ritual occasions. She's there when the younger Richard of York gets married. She's there when Edward IV's children are being christened. Like, I really think she becomes part of the Yorkist regime, probably because by that point she's thinking, well, this is what it's going to be now. It's going to be the Yorkists. We'll have Edward IV, and then we'll have his son Edward V, and so it will go on. Henry VI is out of the picture.
So at what point is Henry Tudor, so Margaret's son, separated from her, and why?
Well, like, there's not much evidence, it must be said, for the period from 1457 till 1461. But there isn't really any sign she's hanging out with him then. Like, she leaves Pembroke within 2 months of his birth and goes and arranges this other marriage. Possibly she's going back. But I think, this is the 15th century when noble women can, even if they really, really like their children, can just leave them in a nursery for months on end, and someone else feeds them, someone else rocks their cradle, someone else brings them up. So that's not unusual behaviour. She's able to do that. In 1461, like I say, the wardship, so basically the upbringing and land of Henry Tudor is handed over to William Herbert, who is a leading Yorkist, and he brings him up within his household and is likely arranging a marriage, in fact, to one of his daughters with Henry Tudor. And Margaret goes to visit Henry Tudor in 1467 in Wales, but she's there for like a week or something. in 1470 to 71, there's this weird readeption when Edward IV is driven off the throne. Henry VI very briefly comes back, and with him comes Jasper Tudor, who's a leading Lancastrian who brings Henry Tudor with him. So Margaret spends a little bit of time with Henry then, and then he goes into exile and she doesn't see him again till 1485. So, like, for the first almost 30 years of his life, she barely sees him.
And what's underpinning the exile? Why did he flee England?
Well, in 1471, after we've had that readeption of Henry VI, Edward IV of York comes back. And at that point, my understanding of Edward IV is that essentially he sort of sets out to get rid of most of the other Lancastrians who are around. He kills a lot of Margaret's cousins, who are the Beauforts, partly in battle and partly after battle, by dragging them out of sanctuary and having them executed. So there's real question, I think, about whether he might be willing to do that to Jasper Tudor and Henry Tudor, who by this point are recognised as being Lancastrians rather than anything else. And so, according to sort of slightly later storytelling, but probably, I think, fundamentally correct, Margaret warns Jasper Tudor that it would be safer if Henry is not in the kingdom anymore, if they actually go abroad. Okay. And Jasper Tudor had already spent years in exile. He was quite used to it. So he takes Henry Tudor with him overseas. They're intending to go to France. They get blown off course and they end up in Brittany, where they live from 1471 until 1483.
Again, maybe I think that thanks to the work of Philippa Gregory and the TV adaptations of her work and stuff, we seem to have this, there's this belief that Margaret spends many, many years plotting her son's return, and ultimately her raison d'etre is to make him become King of England. Again, where is the truth in this? And if there is some truth in that, do we know when she starts that plotting?
I don't think she starts thinking that Henry could be king until 1483. I don't think it happens until after Richard III has had his coup. And I don't know that it would have happened had not Richard III taken the throne in the way that he did. My impression from what I've read, and the enormous amount of time I've spent thinking about this, is that Margaret definitely wants Henry back in the kingdom. But she wants him back, first of all, safely, without risking any of the things that happen to the other Lancastrians who get, one of them gets thrown overboard on a ship at one point. Like, there's some very dicey things going on, I'd say, in terms of how Lancastrians are treated in Edward IV's second reign. And also she wants him back with his estate, because by going into exile with Jasper Tudor, Henry effectively loses all his rights to the earldom of Richmond. He loses his rights to his land. He loses his rights to inherit Margaret's land. And I think for a long time, Margaret is quite suspicious of Edward IV, that if Henry returns without some really ironclad promises, then it will not actually be safe for him. But we get to 1482. So by this point, Henry has been in exile for 11 years. He is in his 20s. He's at the point in life where most noble men are going to be married and having children. And instead, he's still in exile with nothing. And I think by this point, Margaret is sufficiently sort of in the heart of the Yorkist regime that she thinks she can deal with Edward and she can get Henry back safely. And we start to get these suggestions that maybe Henry could come back and have a royal marriage, possibly a marriage to Elizabeth of York even, who is Edward IV's eldest child.
So that's being mooted whilst Edward IV is still alive?
Yes, it's definitely talked about while Edward IV is still alive. Okay. And I suspect that it is being used as a way to ensure that Henry comes back. The other thing that happens in 1482 is Margaret's mother dies. And so that leads to Margaret herself inheriting a load of her mother's land, making deals with her husband Thomas Stanley for how that inheritance is going to be sorted out, for what will happen to it in the future with Henry. So I think there's a real sense of progress effectively at that point, that, okay, we could get Henry back now. We could ensure that he can come home as a nobleman and live a normal life. Yeah. And then a year later, Edward IV dies quite unexpectedly. His son, Edward V, accedes essentially as another child, a child ruler. And then we have Richard III's coup. So that completely alters how things are going to be. Because I think probably Margaret Beaufort imagined that if Edward V was king, like that would kind of work in her favour, really, because then you've got this child king. He's probably going to, listen to the adults around him. He might be quite influenced by, his brother-in-law, say, if Henry Tudor was able to come back and marry Edward V's sister, that could really work for her. Richard III, on the other hand, not so much, because Richard III, firstly, he has thrown this like grenade into the heart of politics. So I think people are genuinely bewildered about what's happened to the princes, because Edward and his brother just sort of disappear into the Tower of London. Richard III, who initially had been claiming that, he was absolutely going to follow Edward and do whatever, make peace with the Woodville family, who are Edward V's mother's family. That completely gets thrown on its head. There's political assassinations, like all sorts of things are going on. And unfortunately for Margaret, her husband at that point, Thomas Stanley, has not the best relationship with Richard. I think probably it was actually a little bit more functional than sometimes it's presented. But it's not without some tension, I'd say, which doesn't really work in her favour. So while Margaret and Thomas Stanley kind of accept Richard III's accession, I think that there are suggestions that right from the summer of 1483, the plots that are ongoing against Richard, already Margaret has probably started to be involved in them. Because for her, presuming that Edward V is still alive, she would rather have Edward V than Richard III.
Yeah, exactly. Because I suppose, again, if Henry Tudor, as he was just then, if he marries Elizabeth of York, then that also kind of neutralises him as a threat to the York family, because he becomes directly involved, I suppose.
Yeah.
So I have to ask the question, because it's again, thanks to the work of people like Philippa Gregory, but also the Ricardian societies and Philippa Langley, Margaret's name has now been tied to potentially the fate of the princes in the Tower. Do you think there is any chance that she was involved in the disappearance? I'm going to assume a big fat no.
Yeah, big fat no, sorry. It would be great, wouldn't it, if I was like, actually, yes, I found an incredible bit of information. It's a note by Margaret and it says, I done it.
Yeah, it was me.
Lol. But no, I don't remotely. I think that the princes in the Tower were dead by autumn 1483, because all of the contemporary evidence seems to suggest it, and it is too peculiar that they are just never seen again under Richard III. And there is absolutely no way that Margaret Beaufort was either sneaking into the Tower or sneaking her secret little tactical people into the Tower to murder these children. I think she wanted them on the throne. I think that's like... I think she was plotting in rebellions to put those boys back on the throne. And I think only when that started to appear impossible, because it started to seem like these children were dead, did she move towards the idea that maybe Henry Tudor himself could take the throne from Richard.
I totally agree. I don't think there's any chance whatsoever that she was involved. And whilst I also, like most people, am of the belief that Richard was ultimately... I don't believe Richard physically killed them himself, but I think he's the man behind the plot. But the big seed of doubt that I have with Richard is when we look at the children of the Duke of Clarence, when Margaret and Edward, Earl of Warwick, because he willingly shows them off. He does... If we think about the rules of primogeniture, technically speaking... later Margaret Pole and her younger brother are ahead of Richard in the line of succession, and he doesn't shut them away. He shows them off, and I've always that is, I suppose, the one piece of big evidence for me that maybe gives Richard III a slight a point that he may have not been behind it, because if he bumped off two royal nephews, there was a third royal nephew kicking about that he didn't do anything to. In fact, he did the opposite, and he openly celebrated him and showed him off to his people. So that's always troubled me slightly, I guess.
Yeah, I suppose it depends how much you think it mattered that they were attainted, that bloodline, really.
Yeah. But that doesn't block access. Richard used that to say that they couldn't inherit, but that my take is that was him rewriting the law to suit his purposes.
Yeah, I also think probably that Richard thought it might be less of an issue than it became, that these two boys disappeared, and suddenly he was like, oh no, hang on, people really don't want me murdering children.
Bugger.
I'd better get all of the other children out and show them off.
Show them off.
Yeah.
So Margaret eventually makes a pact with Elizabeth Woodville that Henry returns to England, hopefully takes the throne, and he'll marry Elizabeth of York. Do you think that Margaret knew that without this, that there was very, very little chance of her son succeeding?
So I think this is part of a longer term plan on Margaret's part. I do think that that she had already hoped that this marriage would happen anyway, as a way to kind of reconcile Henry back into the political system. I think she realised that they needed the Woodvilles, and they also needed the supporters of Edward IV and Edward V, who were the ones who had been leading these other rebellions. I don't think it's as simple as just Henry needed to marry Elizabeth, otherwise he had no right to the throne. I think there is that element to it, definitely. It was hugely important. But I think they also needed a lot of other people to help them. Like, they needed the Woodville affinity, they needed Edward's affinity, they needed the Stafford affinity, they needed the Stanleys. Like, there were a lot of moving pieces, I think. And the marriage was just one part of it.
I see, okay. Obviously, we know that Henry Tudor, as he was then, he lands in England, he fights Richard at the Battle of Bosworth, and he wins. Margaret then becomes My Lady the King's Mother, a title that we believe that she totally invented for herself. And as we discussed earlier, she starts signing letters off as Margaret R. Now, this could have been Margaret Richmond. I think she means Margaret Regina, but and therefore it kind of smacks slightly of imposter syndrome. But I'm curious to know what you think about this and the title that she created. What's going on here, do you think?
I think that this is all the result of Margaret being in quite an unprecedented situation. And I think she actually looks for precedent elsewhere. So I think she looks at, for instance, the situation of Cecily Neville, who was the mother of Edward IV and Richard III, who is also described as the king's mother in things, and who also signs herself Cecily, which is a regal styling to not use any other name, just your singular name, as it were. So I think there is some precedent in what Margaret does. But the big problem she has is that, unlike, I think, every other king's mother, she's married. And that is not usual, because normally what happens is the king's mother was married to the king's dead, so she's a widow. That's quite straightforward. She's got a very clear situation then. But because Margaret's still married to Thomas Stanley, who is not Henry's father, he's his stepfather, there's a bit of a question mark there, I think, about, we know that the Stanleys have really equivocal loyalties. We know that they can change sides quite easily. There must have been some questioning of, well, if a woman is married to a man, is she going to do what her husband says, or is she going to do what her son, the king, says? Where are her loyalties here? And that's why, for instance, in Henry VII's first parliament, we see Margaret being made a femme sole, which is an independent woman with her own estates to administer. But Henry still needs the Stanley support because they are monumentally important militarily. So he has to be very cautious in not making Margaret too independent of Stanley. And Margaret and Stanley continue to have, as far as I've been able to tell, quite a respectful, maybe not affectionate, but companionate relationship for the rest of Stanley's life, even at the point where Margaret becomes a vowess in 1499. So I think Margaret is trying to make a role for herself that makes sense within a system where actually there isn't really a role for her. And the other thing to say is that until the mid-1490s, there are two other king's mothers knocking around. There's Cecily Neville and there's Elizabeth Woodville. So, Margaret has to really make a little niche for herself to fit in. And both of those two previous women have had like slander heaped on them, sexual slander in Cecily's case by her own sons, accusing her of adultery. And in Elizabeth Woodville's case, you know, there's this weird witchcraft thing that sort of gets thrown at her, and that her marriage wasn't legitimate. So I think Margaret is having to be so careful for most of her son's life. The big thing I'd say is that the Margaret R stuff doesn't come in until around 1499, as far as we can tell, as far as surviving documents show. So that suggests to me that kind of it was only once those other royal women were gone, and once Margaret herself had assumed an independent status as a Vowess, that she felt able to be like, okay, yeah, I am, I was about to say Sally Big Potatoes. I don't know. It's the cold. It's the Lemsip hitting me at this point. Like that she was a really important figure in her own right. And I think probably it was Margaret Regina. I think that Margaret and Henry both really enjoyed wordplay. And I think, and punning and jokes and things like that. And I think that probably it was a little nod and a wink to her son as well, being like, I'm Margaret R now. I'm your loving mother, Margaret R. See what I did there?
Yeah. You mentioned there that she becomes a femme sole, and therefore she'll have had she did have huge amounts of land, huge households that she oversaw. From the records, was she a good mistress? Did she, what sort of scale of household are we talking about?
Yeah, it's one of the things that really struck me when I was reading this. And made me really like Margaret, because I think she has this reputation as being this sort of indomitable, slightly frightening, unpleasant, pious old hag. Yeah. And that's just not who she was. Like in the accounts, what comes out, both her household accounts, the descriptions written of her by people who served her or worked with her, what really comes across is the sense that she felt a responsibility to people around her, that she wanted to protect her servants, her tenants, her retainers, that she wanted to improve their lives, and that they really cared about her. There's descriptions of her tending to her servants when they were sick, which she didn't have to do. She was the king's mother, she could do whatever she wanted. And we know that family members would go and stay with her, and sometimes, even be tended to when they were dying as well. She clearly felt a profound sense that she was fortunate, and she wanted to pass that fortune on to other people. And I think that's really worth emphasising, that we don't have here, just because she was powerful doesn't mean she couldn't also be nice.
And I think because the portraits of her as well, it's almost the same portrait several times over, and she doesn't look like a particularly fun character in her portraiture. So again, people read between the lines and think, okay, she must have been this really dour figure, but not the case at all, I guess. One
of my favourite little tidbits I came across was that the black clothes that we see her in those portraits, which are what she wore after she was a Vowess, so after 1499, by which point she was in her mid-50s, so pretty advanced old age for the Tudor period. One of her black gowns would vastly outstrip any other item of clothing in her wardrobe in terms of how much it cost. Her robes as a member of the Order of the Garter, for instance, ermine-lined, crimson, incredibly rich clothes, nothing like as expensive as the black stuff. So what we see may be quite different from what someone in the 15th century would have seen when they were looking at her.
The relationship between Margaret and her daughter-in-law, so Elizabeth of York, is often painted as being quite strained. There's that famous account that Margaret walked just a half pace behind her. Is there truth in this, or do you think the two women got along well?
Again, I think this is just classic misogynist, androcentric writing, basically. I think it was misogyny at the time. Lots of the time, people read back into some reports that were written by the Spanish ambassadors in 1498, where these three particular ambassadors, two of them aren't even technically part of an embassy to England. They're on their way to Scotland, I think. They sort of note in passing that Queen Elizabeth, she's very beloved, but she has no power, and her mother-in-law has complete authority over her and is one of the king's leading advisors. None of these Spanish ambassadors actually seem to have met either Margaret or Elizabeth, and other ambassadors who did don't say this at all.
Right.
And what I have seen in the various different sort of tidbits of evidence that we can gather about these two women is that they worked together. They worked together well. They worked together when Elizabeth's children were getting married to try and make sure that the children were looked after.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, because wasn't it Margaret Beaufort that also she really put in place things around how old Princess Margaret would be sent to Scotland? Margaret Beaufort almost put her foot down and said, no, you're not sending her too young.
Well, it's interesting. You remember it as being Margaret. It was Margaret and Elizabeth did that. So
Okay.
it's both of them. And again, it comes up in a Spanish ambassador's report. But yes, they did. And they said that in part because Princess Margaret was described as being very slight for her age, which is exactly how Margaret Beaufort had been described. So I suspect she saw history repeating and she was like, no, 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 please don't.
Yep.
And Elizabeth completely agreed. And there's lots of connections between Elizabeth and Margaret's households. Lots of the same women move between them, or their husbands are working across different households. We know that they founded chantries together. I really think that this is a relationship where you have a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law who care about each other. And I think Margaret probably saw Elizabeth as an extension of her family, as a daughter, in the same way that Margaret herself had been treated as a daughter by her own mother-in-law, the Duchess of Buckingham. And as she had seen in her own family with all of her half-siblings and her cousins. And I genuinely think that there was a world of female relationship that was not understood in the 15th century and probably has not been understood right up until today. And we still have this really unpleasant tendency, I think, to presume that women hate each other in the 21st century and that two powerful women can't get along. And I think with Margaret and Elizabeth, you have Margaret, who wanted authority, but who totally understood what her role was in that trinity. She always puts the Queen above her in everything. She may be dressed similarly, but not the same as the Queen when the Queen is around. She does not go under the royal canopy. She has a different title. And then we have Elizabeth, who is quite unusual in some ways for the 15th century Queen, in that she clearly doesn't particularly want to get involved in the political sphere, which is no surprise. She'd had such a terrible early life, seeing her mother, her grandmother, her brothers treated badly, her uncles, members of her family assassinated. I probably also would kind of want to take a bit of a step back. So I think they were a bit of a yin and yang, and it worked. But we can't conceive of that for some reason.
Yeah, and it's the same now, isn't it? There just tends to be this thing that we pit, particularly royal women, we pit them against each other.
Yeah. I mean, look at Meghan and Kate. It's exactly the same thing again. There must be a bad one. There must be a good one.
Yeah, and you had the same with the late Queen and her sister Princess Margaret. You had Diana and Fergie. Now you've got Kate and Meghan. It's just this thing that we seem to incessantly do, which is just ridiculous. Margaret's reputation has suffered a lot in recent years, thanks to historical fiction, and we've brought that up a couple of times. But from what you say, she was clearly quite good fun. And I seem to recall hearing a story that she was very into gambling and she loved really fine wine and things like that.
She definitely gave money for gambling. I'm not sure she did it herself. I think she tends to give money to other people. So there's definitely payments in her household accounts to two of her husbands and also to Thomas Stanley's grandson, who was gambling with his father. But she was hunting, she was hawking. She has these networks of friendships where they're exchanging food and wine. There's even another juicy tidbit on the medieval front is that during Lent, an abbess sent her some butter, which, if you understand that during Lent you're not meant to have butter, I think is quite it's quite funny that she has this monastic woman sending her it. And we know that Margaret also, she sponsored actors, that she promoted writing and translation. She had what are called fools, but we might sort of understand as jesters, or indeed people who were called innocents, people who had some sort of additional need or learning difficulty, who were part of her household, who were clearly really important to her, who were like family members, effectively. And yeah, there's lots of evidence, I think, that Margaret enjoyed having a good chat and having a joke and having a drink. But she also, and this is where it feels weird to 21st century eyes, she also did quite religious things, like would wear a hair shirt underneath her very fancy clothing, or would have these giant feasts and then not really eat anything. So, the piety of the 15th century could be quite ostentatious, and it could also be very sort of internal and private, and to our eyes a little strange.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because, again, and I hate to go back over it, but thanks to historical fiction, that she does come across at times as this sort of religious zealot, someone utterly convinced by her conviction in religion. So she is pious, but you don't believe that she was a zealot in the way it's been portrayed.
I think she had a lot of zeal. I think she was very religious, but I also think that there are stages of women's lives where they kind of needed to assume religion a bit as an armour. So I think there is an element here that Margaret does what Cecily Neville did, which is she slightly retreats away from the sort of worldly things and does a lot of masses and does other things, promotes a lot of religious projects. And the other element that's it's just very difficult for us in the 21st century, I think, to make sense of, is Margaret is an enormous patron of education. She founds 2 Cambridge colleges. She founds chantry schools, grammar schools. She helps Henry with founding a hospital. There's loads of different things. She has enormous numbers of publications produced, which are religious in tone. And you can read it in a couple of different ways. You can read it that she is really trying to promote learning and be an educator and a provider of sort of social improvement, really. Or you can read it that she is a religious figure who is sort of doing all of this in order to get into heaven. Or to get her family into heaven, indeed. Mm-hmm. And I think both of those things are true. It's just that to us, we feel like they have to be separate, that politics has to be separate from religion. And actually, in the 15th century, there was no separation. They were the same thing. God gave you a victory in battle,
Yeah. As Henry VII's reign progressed, did Margaret remain as involved in the day-to-day minutiae of his reign, or did it lessen as the years passed and he became more established?
I think she actually gained more power, probably, as it went on. It was just in a slightly different area. So from about 1498 onwards, she goes up to Collyweston, sort of back in her heartland. And she is basically ruling as a sort of regent of that part of the world. She is really in control of things. And it's only when, after Elizabeth of York has died in 1503 and after Prince Arthur has died in 1502, as Henry VII himself starts to get sicker, that Margaret comes back to court and starts living back in court as she had done at the beginning of Henry's reign. I think there's a whole period of time where she's quite an independent power, and we see her trying to assert her own legacy and her family's legacy. But I think she becomes more and more important to Henry because loads of other people who had been dominant political figures die. Old age just takes them out. So by the time Henry VII dies, Margaret Beaufort is one of a handful of people who have been with Henry since 1485 who are still around.
She famously outlives him just by a little over 2 months. So what were Margaret's final days? How did she spend her final days? And do we know how she died?
Sort of. We sort of know how she died. The legend that is told by one of her cupbearers, a man called Henry Parker, who writes this down later, is that she had some swan at the coronation feast of Henry VIII, and that it made her ill, and then she died a very, pious death with a vision of Christ, etc. So, to be really sort of prosaic about it, she got food poisoning from a bad bird, and that sort of did her in. But there is also, it's worth saying that, again, there's a kind of level of metaphor to this, that the swan is connected in Christian and classical iconography with the divine and with Jesus and
purity and
so is it kind of Henry Parker retrospectively being and it wasn't just any bird she ate, it was a swan, the most holy of birds.
And how did she spend her final days? Do you know where she was based? What was she doing?
Basically, she was in Westminster, so it's quite extraordinary, really. She is there when Henry VII dies. She helps pave the way for this political coup by which Henry VIII takes power and gets rid of Empson and Dudley, two of Henry VII's leading advisors, who are two of the most unpopular advisors.
Yes.
And Margaret is definitely involved in that coup. She is definitely playing a part in it.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Yes. And I think she is also, in a very sort of pragmatic way, slightly playing both sides. There's evidence in her household accounts that she's sending gifts to Empson and Dudley as well as to the sort of the other side who ultimately wins, who are Henry VIII's councillors, men like Richard Fox and Thomas Lovell. But also Margaret seems to have hidden the fact that Henry VII died. So she joins in this pretense that Henry VII hasn't died for 2 days in order that Empson and Dudley are kind of caught unawares and taken out before they even realise that he's dead. Because a number of her servants are sent to the Tower of London apparently to get mourning black cloth, and then they spend several days coming back through London, like on what could be a very quick round trip. And it's almost like, are they doing this so that Empson and Dudley don't find out that mourning black is needed? They don't realise the king's dead. So yeah, I think Margaret is definitely involved in that. And she helps oversee Henry VIII's accession, and then she literally gets ill at the coronation feast and dies within Westminster Palace and is buried at Westminster Abbey.
I see. And is that account of her eating the swan and then dying of food poisoning, is that the only account we have of her death?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. So that would suggest then that it probably was a very severe case of food poisoning.
Probably. And also by that point, she has been ill for a number of years on and off.
Yeah,
again, there's in the household accounts, there's all of these payments to different physicians for different medicines. She is in her 60s. Like, it's not surprising.
Yeah, by the standards of the day, that is elderly, isn't it? So
yeah.
Okay, so my final question for you is, I'd love to know if there was something really surprising that you found out about Margaret when you were doing the research for this book. It feels like there's been quite a few tidbits, but was there something that really shocked you?
I don't know if shocked me necessarily. I definitely was surprised by the dynamic between Margaret and Henry when he was young, and the degree to which I really feel like she sort of fled from that relationship for a number of years. One thing that I think is pretty amazing that gets forgotten about Margaret is she was the first English woman to appear in print. So she actually was a translator and publisher of works in her own right. And she patronised printers, she patronised education. She was like really, I think, ahead of her time, perhaps, in understanding the value of printing as a technology that could disseminate information, not just as Henry VII does for sort of political means, but actually as a way to get educational ideas and religious ideas out into the wider world. And she has Henry VII's like funeral speech that's done by John Fisher. She has that printed as well. So she understands that there is this kind of closed world of the royal family where they are all in a room together. And, you know, X many people will hear this bit of preaching by John Fisher. But if you put it in print, hundreds or thousands of people will be informed about it and might, you know, pray for Henry VII's soul or understand something else to do with, you know, a random thing about the Eucharist, whatever it might be. Like, it seems quite arcane, but like when you boil it down to first English woman in print, amazing. Like promoter of learning, amazing. I think a really extraordinary person. I think that was the big thing. I was sort of a bit worried I might not like her as I was doing the research. And there were points when I didn't. But also I was left with this real sense of being impressed by her.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and chatting about this just remarkably fascinating woman. As you say, she's just such a key figure, really, the woman who really starts it all.
Yeah, and like I put Kingmaker in the title of the book because I really think she is. Like, without her, the Tudor dynasty doesn't exist, as far as I'm concerned.
No, definitely. So the book's due out in November. So for anyone who wants to keep up to date with the work that you do, are you on social media?
Yes, I'm at History Lauren. Oh, sorry for the giant ding on my flipping laptop. I'm at History Lauren, and lauren-johnson.com is my website.
Wonderful. Okay, and are you able to say, are you working on something new at the moment?
I'm not yet. I am thinking with my 15 jobs and parenthood, I'm still trying to work out, do I need to write another book immediately? I want to. I know what I'd like to write, but should I?
Okay. How long was the process of this book?
Since 2018. It was supposed to come out in 2021, and then pandemic, archives shut, everything.
Yeah, they always take longer, don't they? I rather naively thought I'd get my book done in 18 months. And it's just like, it was in the end, I think I got it to my publisher 9 months late. But the more everyone I spoke to was like, yeah, that's standard. Don't worry. It's never going to be on time.
Yes, it seems to be. They're sort of getting twice as long every time I do a book. So 12 years time.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you again so much for coming on to the Tudor Chess podcast, and we'll speak soon.
Thanks very much.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess podcast. My thanks to Lauren Johnson for coming onto the show to talk all things Margaret Beaufort with me. Next week, I'm going to be welcoming back Heather Darcy onto the show, this time for a conversation about the early years of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII's marriage. That will drop next Thursday. Thank you for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and speak soon.